In case you think Kenya's politics is something else, I wonder if you watch international media to just see what's happening in the United States day after day after day. Trump's tweets and all of these things, phone calls he makes, leaked documents, and that's exactly what's happening there right now. In fact, talk of impeachment, whether this will go any further than just talk, considering there's a re-election next year, 2020, we'll wait and see. Our JoeAgeyo is in New York City. Oh, now he's settled, so he's not in the streets. Oh, I was really looking forward to seeing the tall buildings. Joe, it's good to see you. So tell us, we thought our politics is something else. Where are we now with the talk of impeachment? The Democrats on one end, the Republicans, we understand there's a few of them that might be thinking there is something there to impeach. The Ukrainian president is in town. Oh my, break it down for us.
All right, thank you very much, Yvonne. Yes, there is a lot going on around here, and I'll just pivot a little bit. I mean, the impeachment is an important domestic story here in the U.S., of course, considering that we have seen the turbulence in this administration pretty much since it came into power. There is actually hardly ever a dull moment when you're talking about the Donald Trump presidency here in the U.S., and that a whole saga of impeachment where he is accused of having essentially trying to basically invite a foreign power to interfere with what happens in the United States is something that we're going to see. But I'm saying that what this has done, I guess inadvertently, is to take the thunder out of a very important thing that has been going on here in New York, which is world leaders are here. And they have not been here to discuss impeachment, but as a matter of fact, very important things in the world. And I think that Donald Trump has distinguished himself as completely being able to steal the headlines from pretty much important things. Like right now, the leaders have been here talking about things they call the Sustainable Development Goals. And traditionally, I have followed this for many years. And traditionally, the United States usually tends to provide leadership. I mean, because this is the world's leading economy. This is the biggest emitter of carbon, for example, the carbon dioxide, which is blamed for climate change. Principally, the U.S. is a leading emitter if you do it what they call per capita emitter. In other words, if you look at all the emissions in the world and divide it by the number of people in this country, every American actually uses a lot in terms of energy and different things, cars and all of these things compared to other people. But what has happened is that the impeachment has basically taken away from all of these things. And I think that if you look at what is happening here domestically, it is quite uncharacteristic that there would be other world leaders coming here. And what everyone is talking about is the possible impeachment. Of course, we'll have to see how that goes here, because it's a divisive issue, considering, of course, the Joe Biden that has been targeted in this phone calls is seen by many as a front runner on the Democratic side, who is likely to face Donald Trump in 2020. So Donald Trump and his cronies haven't helped themselves much with some of the television interviews they've been doing around here to try and deflate this impeachment conversation, but it seems they have dug themselves deeper in a hole. But I said important things have come here. Remember, President Uhuru Kenyatta was speaking yesterday. His conversation seemed to have been lost in this. One of the things he said, which struck me as someone who has followed issues of this nature very closely, was the fact that he was speaking about increasing Kenya's forest cover to 15% by 2022. This sounded, for me, quite phenomenal, considering that for as long as I've been covering these things, we've been attempting to move it from 7% to 10%. And in his speech yesterday, he was still talking about moving it from 7% to 15% in 2022. As a matter of fact, when the NAC government took over in 2003, I remember very well, one of the commitments they made was to move Kenya's forest cover from 7% to 10%, and that was to happen in a period of 5 years. Now, here we are, 2019, President Uhuru Kenyatta, the UN General Assembly, promising that Kenya is going to improve or increase its forest cover by 8 percentage points, quite frankly, within the next 3 years. Quite a feat, I think, and many people will be asking how. But Yvonne, I have gone round and round about all these things that are happening here because there are many things happening here, and the impeachment seems to be the loudest. But I didn't want us to forget that there are very, very many consequential things that have been going on here for the last couple of days.
I just want to follow up on some of those very consequential issues. And you are talking forest cover. We noticed that the president of Brazil, Jair Bolsonaro, actually stole the show as well with what sounded like a very strange denial of the importance of the Amazon forest to the rest of us.
Yeah.
Basically saying, this is our land, not yours. He went tribal.
Well, I mean, you would expect, because I think Bolsonaro is the Donald Trump of Brazil. He is very inward-looking, very insular. But, I mean, the Amazon, many people call it the lungs of the planet. It doesn't quite belong to one country or one region, as a matter of fact. It is a conversation that I have heard here, people talking about it. Remember when there were the Amazon forest fires not too long ago, the entire world appeared concerned, because one of the things that the Amazon is credited with is that it is called, in technical terms, a carbon sink. That basically, because it has so many trees, in very simple terms, it is the global Mao, if you like, where a lot of things come from there. And so if you do not have the Amazon, then basically you're saying that the problem of climate change goes that much higher, because then you do not have the natural forests that typically take in carbon dioxide and then release oxygen. So yes, I think that the comments by the Brazilian president are not too far removed from what has been associated with him, a very insular way of looking at things, and quite frankly, a very right-wing extremist view of the world. And that is not too different, I think, in the eyes of many people from what Donald Trump has been doing here. So interesting parallels, but I think the Amazon cannot be ascribed to any one country, and we are going to be hearing quite a bit of that going forward.
Let's talk a bit about Africa, Joe. What does Africa bring to the table? I mean, apart from an occasional speech here and there, you know, President Kenyatta saying, talking about improving the forest cover in Kenya. I mean, globally, the big players out there, we have Iran with a big issue, Saudi Arabia with quite a substantive issue. What are African leaders bringing to the table? What do they pop out about?
Well, I mean, I think that Africa has projected itself over the years as a victim of different things. If you think about all the different factors that determine how global affairs move, the African leaders tend to present themselves as victims of the rest of the world in terms of economic policies, in terms of politics, and lately even in terms of climate change, for example, where they say, well, you know, we are not responsible for the problem, but we take in most of the impact, because climate change, as you know, for example, affects different parts of the world differently, and Kenya being one of those frontline states, if you like, in terms of the impacts of climate change. And I'm talking about the fact that the country has what experts call an over-reliance on climate-sensitive sectors. So you're talking about agriculture, rain-fed agriculture specifically. You're talking about tourism that dies if the global temperatures change. Basically, if there's drought, that does something to the animals. There is now a growing fear about what could happen to the oceans, for example, if climate change continues to rise, and therefore the coastal settlements, that sort of thing. So I think that there is a narrative, some of it warranted, but I think that Africa for too long comes to these meetings as a victim of what the rest of the world is doing, and therefore looking for ways of being helped in different ways. And I think that that has been the dominant sort of narrative that you keep hearing, where African leaders basically complain, if you like, about the things that are happening. And many analysts will say, well, there are many challenges facing Africa that Africa is not necessarily responsible for. But Kenya, for example, and other African countries will be more concerned about, for example, have there been commitments, have developed countries, for example, followed through with the commitments they have made on helping African countries to deal with some of these impacts that are beginning to be felt in different places. You've seen droughts being succeeded by floods, and floods succeeding droughts, and that cycle continues. And those kinds of things are likely to concern African leaders that come to these meetings, and they come here seeking to get some help. But you can see that every country is now beginning to look so inwardly that it is going to be a surprise, I think, if some of these commitments are met at the international level.
Joe, another extended hand, that sounds quite uncomfortable, but just talk to us briefly on the issue of carbon emissions. With African countries, how much do we contribute to these emissions?
Well, negligible, quite frankly. If you think about it, I think it could be anything like 1% or something like that the last time I checked. But that is not why Africa is concerned about climate change. There are two sides of the carbon emissions, two sides to the climate change conversation. There is one side they call mitigation. There's one side they call adaptation. Basically, mitigation is what are these things that countries can do to make sure that there's no more climate change, if you like, or at least to try and slow it down. And adaptation, which is where countries like Kenya truly come in, is that yes, we have not contributed that much in relative terms to climate change, but we are being affected more than other people. And also we have the least capacity compared to other countries to deal with it. For example, there are countries where if there is drought, they have many government programs that can help people. There are countries where they can quickly change their agricultural systems. For example, if the temperatures rise in certain places, it means there are crops that can no longer grow there. But in countries like Kenya, the capacity to switch very quickly to different types of crops or to develop varieties that then can grow in those places is a bit limited. But in countries such as the US and parts of Europe, you find that they are able to very quickly move to the next thing that is required. In Kenya, for example, there are places where malaria never used to be seen, some of the more highland areas like in Kisii, Kericho, and right now malaria is being witnessed in some of those places. So the country is not equipped to deal with these changing circumstances. So for countries such as Kenya, the question is not so much about how much we contribute, but how much we are affected. And that is why in international parlance, there's something they call common but differentiated responsibilities, which means that, yes, everybody has a responsibility and it is common, but it is differentiated because some countries have contributed more than others, yet other countries are being affected more than the ones especially that contributed. So for African countries, their issue when it comes to climate change is not about whether they are causing or not. They are making a small contribution to the problem, but they are basically the ones who are bearing the greatest brunt of climate change. And that is the kind of position that developing countries typically tend to take when they come for this mega UN conference, such as the one that is happening or has been happening here in New York.
Joe, I'm just asking this on behalf of Francis. He's saying with all the toxic content of our politics, it's still below 1% carbon emissions.
Oh, wow. And I think what should concern us, I think, is the fact that there are many things to be dealt with. For example, one of the things that the president, I think, was being asked on the sideline is how this whole politics back home is affecting the realization of, say, the Big Four, which is directly connected to these new goals that they're talking about. Right now, they are the things that are called Sustainable Development Goals, which were agreed to about 4 years ago, which basically deal with issues of poverty, issues of education, issues of health, and all the different things that are supposed to improve the economic well-being of people. But and that is the big conversation that has been going on here. But yet, when you think about it, we are talking about Tanga Tanga, Kieleweke, and all of those things since we went for the election and came out of it, and not much is happening in terms of making this the so-called Big Four agenda work, or at least anything related to it that improves the lives of people. But at the same time, we don't seem to worry too much. Yet, actually, without the economic basis of the country going to the next level, it is unlikely that people's the lot of the majority of Kenyans will improve anytime soon. And that, I think, is a big issue. So Tanga Tanga, Kieleweke, yeah, they are quite toxic, but I think at the end of the day, there is a price that the country pays, because then there isn't a focus on the things that many people believe would make a difference in the day-to-day lives of people in Banana.
Absolutely, Joe. Thank you. Just
one last one, Joe, before we let you go. And that's about the big stage that is the UN General Assembly normally is, especially that very coveted podium. You know, in previous General Assembly sessions, we had outstanding African leaders who stole the show. They clearly stood out. We had the late Colonel Muammar Gaddafi of Libya, and we had Robert Mugabe of Zimbabwe, and of course, before he retired in his very short stint, Nelson Mandela of South Africa. Any names worth noticing on that platform from African nations that are really commanding the respect of the audience?
I mean, sadly, it is difficult to find any that stands out, because, as you rightly mentioned, I mean, even people who had reputations that were not exactly great, like Mobutu, they would come to the UN and make substantive statements that would be addressing global issues from a philosophical point, from a standpoint of ideology, where they would be saying this is what the Western countries are doing that is hurting our people. But I think right now there is very little substance, quite frankly, in the way that conversations happen at the UN. That is why people like the Brazilian president stand out, not so much because of the substance of what they say, but because of just how ridiculous some of these things are. I think Robert Mugabe, you mentioned him. I mean, he was many things to many people, but you have to give it to him. When he came here to New York, he spoke his mind, and he spoke what a lot of Africans and Kenyans, of course, who would have wanted said by an African leader. Right now, I regret to say, quite frankly, that it is difficult to pinpoint any one leader that would speak, and everyone is waiting to hear what they are going to say. I think maybe African leaders need to do a bit of soul searching and ask themselves, where is that Robert Mugabe who would keep everyone on tenterhooks, waiting to hear what he's going to say? What about Muammar Gaddafi? Anytime he would speak. I mean, if you look further afield, there were people like Fidel Castro from Cuba who would speak, I don't know, they used to say for how many hours, but at the end of the day, people wanted to hear, what is this guy going to say? He's not going to say things that everybody else will say, but they're the exact sort of things that people wanted said on that stage, because that is a big stage. I mean, the whole world is watching, so you better say something notable. So I think that it is an indictment, in my view, of the quality of leadership that exists right now in Africa, and just the ability of the African presidents and other leaders to engage with the real issues that determine how global politics is played now. And I think that it will be a while, perhaps, before we can see people who would have that kind of standing in the eyes of the international community, and people would bring the General Assembly to a standstill when they come to New York every September.
Indeed. And I think there's a picture going around on Twitter of President Emerson Mnangagwa of Zimbabwe speaking to a seemingly empty room. I mean, there's literally no one there. JoeAgeyo, live from New York City, thank you very much. And thanks as well to Jamila Mohammed, who is also in New York. I think they should be back next week, hopefully. Hopefully they don't stay there or get lost in the streets of New York. It can happen. And thanks also to Professor Alfred Omenya, who's an architect.